Good afternoon. I'm Dr. Kay Stefanik, Assistant Director of the Iowa Nutrient Research Center. I want to welcome you all to our Spring 2026 seminar series, Status of Nutrient Reduction Strategies in Upper Mississippi River Basin States. This semester, we will have speakers from Wisconsin, Minnesota, Illinois, and Indiana. Before we begin, I just have a few housekeeping items. First, please type any questions you have into the chat box, and I will read those to the speaker at the end of the presentation. Second, this webinar will be recorded and posted to the INRC's website along with previous seminars. So for today's talk, today's speaker is Matt Drewitz, research scientist with the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency. He has worked for the state of Minnesota for over 25 years in water quality policy, planning, and research. Matt's work focuses on impacts from nutrients and sediment, watershed models and tools for decision support, and connecting watershed efforts to water quality improvements. He was a member of a diverse team of agency and university staff that helped revise and update Minnesota's nutrient reduction strategy, which was posted in January 2026. He will be presenting on the Minnesota 2025 Nutrient Reduction Strategy Update and next steps. So with that, the floor is yours.
Hey, thank you, Kay. Well, good afternoon. I really appreciate the opportunity to come and talk to you all about the Minnesota Nutrient Reduction Strategy Update. And I want to give a little bit of a shout out to my coworker, Corey Layfield, who is also our Nutrient Reduction Strategy Coordinator, and also to Dave Wall, who was the lead scientist and lead of our nutrient strategy work for many years, and he retired back in October. So, but he was a big part of this work, and so was Corey and many others. So I'm going to give a little update on where we've been over the last decade here, really with Minnesota's nutrient reduction strategy, and kind of talk about some things that we're looking to do, what we did in our update, and what we're looking to do in the future. So again, I'll talk about update to our strategy. I'll look at the nutrient sources and our science assessment. Look at watershed management in Minnesota, and then look at the water quality trends and priorities, and then next steps for implementation. So with that, Minnesota is a big state, and we have kind of a diverse landscape, diverse land uses, and also just where our water is going. So, and in Minnesota, most of the water is going towards the Gulf through the Mississippi and the Minnesota river basins, and then we also have water that's going towards the north, towards Lake Winnipeg, through the Red River north, and then also through the Rainy River to Lake of the Woods. And then we have the Great Lakes with Lake Superior. So we have we've got water going different directions, and we've got some different goals. Depends on where you are in which basin you're in. We're just trying to protect things in the Great Lakes, keep water qualities good, keep it good. And for Lake Superior, River North, we've got a little over 50% reductions in nitrogen and phosphorus for our nutrient goals based on kind of an international group for the International Red River Board, kind of what they've kind of come up with for goals. And then also, to the south, we have a 45% reduction to the Gulf for nitrogen and phosphorus, kind of, which is very similar to other states and what the goals are for the hypoxia task force. And so those goals are really for the nutrient strategy for going to the Gulf. It's from the baseline periods that started in the early 1980s versus there's a different baseline period actually for Lake Winnipeg, those impacts, and that started in the 1990s. So since this is a group, we're talking to folks here in Iowa as well, we've got some of our water that goes directly to Iowa. Most of the state drains and goes through the Mississippi River at the Iowa border, but we also have the Cedar River, Des Moines River, and Missouri River Basin here in Minnesota, where we've got water going that way, and then also the Blue Earth River comes up from Iowa into Minnesota, into the Minnesota River Basin. And we are kind of the headwaters of the Mississippi River. So if you get a chance to go to Itasca State Park in northern Minnesota, up by Bemidji, it's a good chance to kind of see how small it is at that point. So with our nutrient reduction strategy, like many states, hypoxia task force states for the Gulf, we created a strategy in the 2010s. So in 2014, we adopted our first nutrient reduction strategy. And then in 2020, we did a progress report, kind of where we were at It wasn't a full update or revision, but we kind of looked at kind of what are the major milestones we're trying to get towards and what types of new programs and what we've seen for monitoring information. So we did an up little bit of a progress report there. But our recent strategy that was just posted, our final version back in January, we did a major revision to it and updated a lot of the data, and I'll show kind of what we're looking at for what we did for changes. And then our goals are kind of set out for 2040, and this is kind of what our leadership had decided many years ago. We have a 2035 goal that's kind of nationwide for the Gulf, but we've had for our overall statewide goals, we've kind of set it at 2040 for nitrogen and phosphorus for all the basins. We did, through the process of doing a revision, we had a lot of public review. So we had a lot of different public meetings and webinars to get public input. And we also had a public comment period that was last summer. And so we got a number of letters, got 62 letters from various different groups, kind of a half between individuals and from other basically organizations representing different sectors. And so and we got 466 total comments. So we've got a lot of information we've got from them, a lot of feedback, and we made some adjustments to our nutrient strategy, kind of our draft that we had last summer based on those comments. And some of the kind of the common topics we got for just the feedback we got on our strategy, overall we had generally we had support from most commenters on what we put together, and so that was good to hear. But we also heard a lot of feedback about actually regulations on various sectors, whether it's on the non-point or point source side. We had some folks who were for more regulations, some for less, so kind of split between that. And we got a lot of support for making sure that we have, continue to do, support farmers and rural landowners with education incentives and networking. And with that, also supporting our kind of local government staff and NRCS, and so the practitioners out there helping with landowners. We got a lot of support for continuous living cover. That was probably what we got the most support for amongst various groups. And then we've got a pretty good monitoring network for our water quality information. And they just want to make sure that we're continuing to look at trends long term, but there was a lot of concern about just our lack of progress on nitrogen. And then within our strategy, we talked about a potentially future aquatic life nitrate standard in Minnesota, and that's not in place. We don't have a timeline for that right now, but we got a lot of comments kind of for that and against that from various groups. I want to talk a little bit about what we updated in our strategy. We have a lot of new, monitoring data and nutrient load information. So we worked with all of our partners to get that updated. I'll talk about this later in a few slides. We have our Minnesota Watershed Management Framework, where we've done a lot of TMDL work and watershed restoration protection strategy work and watershed plans. So a lot of that work was not in place in our original strategy. So we talked about that. There's a lot of new science that's been out there, both on the municipal side of things for like wastewater and urban stormwater, as well as on the agricultural side for best management practices. And then we wanted to make sure we had a focus on groundwater and drinking water on our nutrient strategy. And there's been a lot of concern about that, especially in southeastern Minnesota and our karst region. And so there's a kind of a separate effort that was going on there, just focusing on what to do in that part of the state. And so we want to incorporate some of those ideas as well. And we had a number of new programs that are out there on the state side, and out on the federal side we wanted to talk about and how that's helping ramp up implementation. And then there's new ways we can track some of this information and progress towards the future. And with our nutrient strategy, we had a number of different contributors. You can see our kind of our list of our state agencies outside the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency. And then we also had, our University of Minnesota, with the Metropolitan Council, which is in the Twin Cities metro area, and they kind of work with on the wastewater and the stormwater and the monitoring side. And then with INRCS and USGS on the federal side. So we had over 100 staff from various different organizations kind of helped put this update together. So again, we wanted to look at, both the impacts to the hypoxic zone at the Gulf and also at Lake Winnipeg in Canada with algal blooms that they find there as well. But within our strategy, we also incorporated what's going on with Minnesota's waters for nutrients and kind of what both the surface water side and the groundwater side of things. And so we can kind of help tie in those those priorities and goals, with kind of these high level priorities for out of state needs. And especially since Minnesota is kind of a headwaters state here, for the Gulf, it's a long ways away from the Gulf. So trying to make it real for people here too, that if we do things for the Gulf and for Lake Winnipeg, it will also help our local water quality as well. So I'll talk a little bit about, kind of watershed management in Minnesota. And one of the things that we have is we have this watershed management framework that's been in place for a number of years now. This really came out of in the 2000s. We had in the late 2000s, we had the Clean Water Fund. Actually, it's actually our legacy amendment, constitutional amendment that has dedicated funding for clean water work. And through that, we kind of create a system of where we're making sure that we're doing monitoring and assessment. We're looking at problems for water quality at the watershed level, doing what we call watershed restoration protection strategies, which kind of bundle our TMDL work together, paired water work, and then developing these comprehensive plans, and that can help towards implementation. And so one of the things that we achieved in the last few years is through each major watershed here within Minnesota, we have a watershed restoration protection strategy. And so we've got that covered now in the state. We're now doing kind of second level strategies now that kind of look at all the water quality issues and look at both areas where we have impairments and also places, especially in northern Minnesota, where we want to protect the water quality and keep it good. And also, we've been developing watershed plans loosely based on the major watersheds. And in the Twin Cities metro area, we've had watershed plans in place for decades, watershed-based plans. But in the outstate of Minnesota, we had county water plans, and so we kind of did a transition in the 2010s to go towards watershed-based plans, of which then we can help, bring in elements of the nutrient strategy and other large-scale documents and bring it into those. So we almost have full coverage now of these watershed plans with kind of strategy or kind of information on what they want to do and budgets of how to do implementation towards meeting nutrient goals. And also we've been tracking kind of both our practices that have been implemented and on the agricultural side, both from the federal government and also from state government. And so we've seen a lot of increases, especially with our legacy amendment and more money going towards implementation, and seeing a lot more implementation going on the ground. And so with that, we've been updating kind of the science behind our strategy. And this kind of lumps in the whole state. If we took a look at the state as a whole, kind of where the nutrient sources are coming from. And for the most part, for nitrogen and phosphorus, if you kind of average things out, it's mostly coming from agriculture, with another chunk, coming from, from the wastewater side of things. We also look at kind of stream bank erosion, forestry, and other types of this other category. But, agriculture is kind of the primary source of nutrients, especially nitrogen. And so with that, we kind of reevaluate our source assessment of where we're seeing the nutrient sources coming from, whether it's on the agricultural side or from the wastewater or the stormwater side of things or feedlots. And we kind of broke that down by phosphorus and nitrogen at those three major basins. And I think the most important thing here to look at is just that, Minnesota is it's a very diverse landscape and diverse water quality issues. And you can see that even between like the Mississippi River and the lake, kind of the Lake Winnipeg basin as well, we're seeing, even some differences there where our sources are coming from. But for the most part, we see, especially in the Mississippi River Basin, and that really has more impacts going towards the Gulf and towards Iowa, is that we've had, really tile drainage and just kind of, leaching of nitrogen through the groundwater pathways, as we're seeing where nitrogen's coming from. Then a lot of our phosphorus is coming from cropland, runoff, and from the wastewater and stream bank side of things. So this is something we're going to try to reevaluate, and we go in the future, like every 5 years, try to take a look at our source assessment and update that over time. One of the big efforts we had is we updated our science assessment for the agricultural side of things, both for nitrogen and phosphorus. And so Dr. Laura Christensen and Dr. Carl Rosen with the University of Minnesota, they updated, and Laura, I think, is back at University of Illinois. They've been working on, they worked on the nitrogen side of things, and we looked at kind of the nutrient efficiencies for kind of 4 major buckets, which are nutrient management, kind of cover crops, drainage water management, and then kind of changing the land use, or continuous living cover. And we evaluated the nutrient efficiencies for these practices. In Minnesota, we have a lot of, on the first bucket here, we have a lot of nutrient management that's already in place, but the efficiencies are lower. And we're seeing increases in cover crops and a little bit on the drainage water management side, but even those are more effective practices for reducing nitrogen, but we've seen that we still haven't had a lot of adoption there. So it's a good. I think for us, it was good to go through this and get this really good information together. It's a pretty substantial document, and we use a lot of data and research from Iowa and Illinois and Wisconsin that actually helped inform our science assessment, because in Minnesota, sometimes we're kind of lacking some of the research on some of these practices. So thank you for the folks at Iowa State for all the work you've done. And we also looked on the phosphorus side of things, and Dr. Emerson Souza and Carl Rosen with the University of Minnesota worked on this. And we kind of looked at some of those similar practices, but kind of adding in more of those structural BMPs that we see, and conservation tillage and those types of things, and looking at those effectiveness. And one of the things we're finding too is just on the research side of things, we've got a lot more information on nitrogen, versus phosphorus, and that's kind of an area that we need to focus on in the future as well. But we have a number of appendices to our nutrient strategy. Our overall document is like over 300 pages, and there's another 1,200 pages of supporting documents, of which I think these two science assessments were about 230 pages. So go check that out on our webpage and see all that information. So again, these kind of 4 major buckets of practices on the agricultural side of things. We have a number of, kind of within our strategy, we talked about some of the more detailed aspects of what needs to be accomplished, or types of things could be done. So we've got infield fertilizer management, which we can get some lower reductions, but we can cover this in many acres. So trying to look at all these various different practices that are helpful. On the cover crop side of things, we actually, I think from the research, we're finding that from our original strategy, we kind of had a higher reduction value for, especially on the nitrogen side of things for cover crops. And we kind of made that a little more conservative, because based on some of the newer research, especially in colder climates, we're finding a little less on the nitrogen reduction side of things. But I think there's a lot of needs that we could do for research in the future to kind of bolster some of that information, especially looking at cover crops using multiple different types of species out there. And then we're looking at perennials, and there's a lot of research going on at the University of Minnesota on perennial crops, and looking at adding those into the system, either as kind of a relay with like soybeans or a crop onto themselves. And I'll talk a little bit about that later. And then on the drainage water management side of things, looking at all these various practices, saturated buffers, controlled drainage, bioreactors, trying to add those into our systems. And we're starting to see that pick up a little bit, but I think there's some good work in Iowa that from the batch and build program that we could try to replicate here in Minnesota, would help kind of bring some of this forward a little bit more. So that kind of goes over just what we did, at least on the agricultural side, on some of the research. I should mention too, on the On the research side of things, we've got some interesting analysis we did on cold water climates for wastewater treatment, and kind of looking at nitrogen optimization as well. So there's some good research information there as you can check out on our website too. So with kind of water quality trends and looking at priorities here for the state, again for monitoring the main stems of the major rivers here. For Minnesota, we've got a number of monitoring sites through our watershed pollutant load monitoring network, and a lot of good information that goes back many years, and working with various partners and collecting data. For the Mississippi River, we look at Red Wing here, just south of the Twin Cities. That's kind of where we do our look at for our progress on the Mississippi River Basin, and then also at Emerson here, just right on the Canadian, North Dakota, Minnesota border on the Red River side of things. So anyway, we've got really good information on these permanent sites. Then we have a lot of other sites that are up outside the main stems as well that we go and monitor as well. So this information is really helpful for helping with our nutrient strategy work, but also helps the watershed modeling that we do across the state too. So on this slide here, I'm just showing you kind of where our status of where we're at. On the right hand side is looking at what our remaining load goal is for nitrogen for the Mississippi River, and the 45% reduction. We've had about a 6% reduction progress. So we've got about 39% of our load reduction load that's needed. So we got a ways to go on nitrogen. But if you look on the left hand side, this kind of looks at. We also created some priority maps based on kind of local needs for both aquatic life on the nitrogen side of things, where we have higher levels of nitrates in the streams, or nitrogen in streams, and then also where we have issues with drinking water wells. And I'll talk about that later. So we try to look at both what's going on leaving our state and what are those kind of in-stream local watershed priority areas as well. And then on the wastewater, or on the phosphorus side of things, I guess I was thinking about wastewater. We've had a really good reduction from our 45% goal. We've got about 13% load reduction that's still needed, and most of that has been through kind of wastewater treatment plant upgrades over the last 20 years, and been a lot of investment in that. And so that's, and especially in the Twin Cities and some of the larger cities like St. Cloud, Mankato, Rochester, they've done a lot of work, and so made good progress there. But on the phosphorus side of things, we have a lot of lakes in Minnesota, so we want to look at eutrophication issues there, what are priorities both for protecting lakes and also ones that are eutrophic. And then also we've got areas where we have river eutrophication within different rivers and streams. And so looking at how we can prioritize phosphorus work that will help with those impairments as well. So this is kind of, we're looking at our kind of our progress here on our phosphorus loads. And again, we've made pretty good progress on the urban side, but it's going to have to come from mostly on the agricultural side to try to meet our 45% reduction goal down the road. And then on nitrogen, we've there's a significant need that's going to be needed to get this load reduction that's going to be needed, and that's really going to have to come mostly from the cropland side and a little bit on kind of the optimization side on the urban side for like wastewater and working on stormwater side of things as well. In the Red River Basin, we have kind of similar goals, for nitrogen and phosphorus, but our loads, especially on the nitrogen side, are really about a fraction of what they are in the Mississippi River Basin. And so one of the challenges we have is that in northern Minnesota, the loads are much lower. It's colder, there's more winter, lots of winter in Minnesota, but there's a lot of winter in northwestern Minnesota. And because of that, we don't get the same kind of runoff, but Lake Winnipeg is very sensitive to both nitrogen and phosphorus. So in many cases, we may not have a phosphorus problem or nitrogen problem locally, but collectively, as you add that all together, and with the Dakotas and Manitoba, adding that all in, it still becomes an issue. So that's one of the challenges we'll have kind of long term with that. And on the phosphorus side of things, we don't have the population base is pretty small, so we can't rely on the wastewater side to get our goals. And kind of the same thing for the nitrogen side of things as well. We don't have as much tile drainage up there, and different kind of soils as well compared to southern Minnesota. But we're working with our partners. We've just had conversations with our, just like we do with our hypoxia task force counterparts in different states. We also connect with our partners in North Dakota and Manitoba. We just talked with them recently, and so how we can kind of coordinate together and work on these goals collectively. And then again, we're looking at kind of in our original strategy, we didn't really talk about Lake Superior, and mostly because it's really we don't have any water quality problems with nutrients that much, but we're trying to have a no net increase for Lake Superior. I'm going to talk a little bit about before I talk about loads, I want to talk about some of the concentration trends for both phosphorus and nitrogen. And so we've been over the last almost 2 decades here, we've seen a pretty good decrease in our trends and phosphorus concentrations within a lot of our streams and rivers, and then we've had some areas where where things have just kind of stayed the same. But kind of a different story when we look at nitrogen or nitrate nitrogen concentrations, where we've seen some slight increases in parts of the state, and then some slight decreases in the state, and then a lot of where things just are just staying the same. So a lot more no trends being detected. And so as a whole, for the Mississippi, we've only seen a 6% reduction in nitrogen. And one of the things to keep in mind is that some of our heaviest loads, you'll see this in the next slide, are coming from this part of the state for nitrogen contributions, and we are seeing some slight reductions. But up here we have much lower loads. And for example, just on the concentration side, in Anoka, Minnesota, where they measured the Mississippi River north of the Twin Cities, typically the average kind of long-term average nitrate nitrogen concentration is under 1 milligram per liter, but down here in Jordan, Minnesota, just before the Twin Cities on the Minnesota River, it's just under 3 milligrams per liter. So there's about concentration levels are about a third up here as they are down here. So even though we've seen decreases here, this is where we have our biggest areas of concern. So, and this is just a map showing, actually showing nitrogen in 2 different ways for kind of our watershed goals. And basically we're looking at kind of loading rates of total nitrogen that's being delivered at the Huck 8 the major watershed outlets at the Huck 8 level. And those are really, you can kind of see that there. And then on the right-hand side, these are the load goals for nitrogen reduction that we need to meet kind of our nutrient strategy goals. And so for these watersheds in the southern part of Minnesota that would, outlet to the Mississippi River at the Iowa border, those are the goals are needed at those major watershed outlets to actually what are needed to then meet our 45% reduction on nitrogen. And really the map is very similar on the phosphorus side of things, but it's kind of this southern part of the state where we have our higher loads for sure. And you can kind of read through chapter 2, and it kind of goes through this all in detail in our nutrient strategy. And then one thing I want to mention too is just on our priority watersheds. I'd mentioned this before, but we have on the left-hand side, we're looking at kind of areas where we have higher nitrate issues, and with the darker watersheds can have an average over 8 milligrams per liter. And one of the things that we have we've been thinking about down the road is if there's ever an aquatic life nitrate standard or impairment for nitrate nitrogen, these areas where you see kind of the darker purple lines here are over that 8 milligrams per liter, and those are areas that would probably have impairments if there was a standard for that, which we do not have at this point. But just kind of gives you a sense of how that relates. And then we have kind of 3 distinct areas of where we have groundwater issues. We have issues in southeastern Minnesota because of karst geology. We have nitrogen issues in let's call our central sands area of Minnesota, where we have a lot of coarse textured soils, and we have a lot of irrigation in this part of the state. But you think in Minnesota we have lots of water, why would we have irrigation? But that's just based on the soil types. And then in southwestern Minnesota, we have issues both with water quantity and water quality as we get more toward the west. And so then we do have some trend information on wells, but that is not as robust as our surface water information, but something we're kind of building on over time. And then we've kind of taken this map just kind of combines the priorities both for the nutrient strategy as what's leaving the state, and then with those local priorities as well. And we're hoping to kind of work with our kind of local watershed groups and partners to kind of help incorporate some of this information to future planning efforts as well. And then we can use this also as we're looking at federal initiatives from USDA, NRCS, or others, and how we can target project money in the future to some of these areas that have concerns. So I guess I'm going to talk about some next steps here too, and what we're looking at doing for implementing our strategy. And a lot of the work that you've seen here, a lot of the monitoring information that we've collected over the last couple decades almost now is really through our legacy amendment and the Clean Water Fund in Minnesota, and also want to shout out for EPA funds that have helped the the bipartisan infrastructure law funds that we received that we can help use towards developing our update, which kind of gives us a better roadmap for the future that's more up to date. So some of the things that we really need to focus on, and I kind of mentioned this a little bit before, is we've done a really good job on the wastewater side of looking at phosphorus reduction, and we've seen a 76% reduction from phosphorus over the last few decades. But there's a lot of work to do on the nitrogen side of things for the wastewater sector, even though it's a smaller component. But we're looking at how over long term, as when you're working with the wastewater and infrastructure, it's not something you just fix overnight. These are you work on these, and then it'll be a few more decades before you come back. So we want to make sure that when we're kind of got a kind of phase strategy of how to work with various facilities as they're coming online or coming in and doing upgrades, and how we can look at looking at different ways to do optimization for nitrogen reduction. And again, this just kind of shows what we have for information from discharges, and which has kept pretty flat here over since 2010 to now on what we're seeing for nitrogen discharges. But one of the things just to show here is that we're collecting a lot more observed values, not just estimated or modeled information, and we're finding that so that we have a better sense of where we're at long term. And we developed a separate wastewater nitrogen reduction strategy that was developed with kind of the wastewater sector, and that was referenced in our overall nutrient strategy for the whole state. One of the things we're trying to do too is kind of continue work at these local levels and get folks together and talk about how we can incorporate these nutrient strategies at the kind of the grassroots level. And so that's both, as you can see here, this is a watershed group meeting together, talking about issues. We've got, we have a pretty robust monitoring network, so we want to make sure we enhance that. And some of the things we're doing right now, we've got some short-term money from our state legislature to look at kind of continuous nitrate networks in various places around the state, and that just started last summer. And so we're doing that to kind of see if we can see some of these trends, that are happening, monthly to yearly to daily, on the nitrogen side of things. So we're going to continue to kind of enhance kind of how we do our monitoring work. And really, it's kind of like, then what do we learn, from doing lots of monitoring, doing a lot of reports, assessing the problems, doing total maximum daily load work, and then working with partners and implementing things. Then kind of how do we change things to better reflect what's needed and keep that going. One of the biggest things that came out of our nutrient strategy is just making sure that we have, adding more continuous living cover to the landscape. And in Minnesota versus some other states, we're in a colder climate than even Iowa is, and so there are some challenges with that. And so there's been a lot of effort that's been put in over the last, especially the last 10 years, with two major kind of efforts at the University of Minnesota. One is the Forever Green Initiative, which looks more at kind of land use changes with perennial crops, winter annuals, native woody crops, and are doing a lot of work with Kernza and pennycress and camelina, that type of thing. And so we've got a strong effort going there, a lot of support from our legislature on that. And then back in the 2010s, the Minnesota Office for Soil Health at the University of Minnesota was established to really work on the cover crop side of things and improving soil health. And we've got Jody DeJong Hughes here, and then Dr. Anna Cates, who's kind of leads up this with Marcel Lewandowski. And so that's been having these two kind of almost like centers here at the University of Minnesota has been helpful to kind of propel this forward. And so with that, we've got a lot of needs for continuous living cover, and kind of looking at our on the nitrogen side of things, we need nearly 8 million acres of some sort of cover somewhere, whether that's cover crops or small grains or increasing pasture, that type of thing. And so one of the things we're looking at doing is putting together a task force that looks at continuous living cover, and then seeing how we can get another 1 million acres on the ground and what that's going to take. And then we're also looking at developing kind of a CLC tracking system long term as well. And then just kind of builds on this, just looks at our all the kind of the practices that we would need both on the agricultural side and on the wastewater side of things. Basically our load reduction needs and the number of acres. And so really our priority areas of concern are looking at drainage water management practices, continuous living cover, and kind of on the urban wastewater. Those are the areas that we need the most reduction of nitrogen from. And if we meet our nitrogen goals, because we've made some progress on phosphorus, we'll be able to make those as well. So, but there's a big need, and we're also working with the University of Minnesota to look at some of the economics long term of how we can maybe better get there. Okay. And also mentioned just on, we're trying to protect our high quality waters and working with various groups with Lake Superior, on how to have long-term strategies for that as well. And then really trying to help bolster our science, bolster the tools that we look at for tracking progress, and, making sure we've got the modeling and the monitoring information behind things. And then we have dashboards and other types of visuals that people can look at information from our strategy, and for the public and for our practitioners using this information. And here to kind of wrap up here, some of the things that we've been looking at for tracking progress. We've had for the last few years, we've been at the basin level, we've been trying to track living cover, erosion control practices, drainage water management, and nutrient management practices. And then we can look at progress over time basically from government programs, and then we can also look at specific types of practices like cover crops, and seeing if here we're seeing increases in cover crop adoption based on these various government programs. So we have those application like this that's available, looking at basin wide, and then we can also look at some of that data as well at the major watershed level, and then you can even get down to that kind of minor watershed or Huck 12 level as well for the last 20 years. And we've got a lot of good information there we can bring in from both kind of lumping in federal and state government program information. And then with that too, we've created this new tool called the beat tracker tool, BMP effects estimator tool, where we actually bring in those BMPs that have been put on the ground, and then use our modeling information to kind of see where we've seen reductions, most reductions, and that we can use this kind of for watershed planning efforts as well to kind of see, well, have we targeted the right places at these smaller watersheds, and where have we made progress and where there's more progress needed. And then lastly, we've kind of created this a tool that we can look at both the major watershed and the basin level, where we could track goals on various practices. You could input the number of BMPs that you'd like to implement, and seeing how that gets towards meeting our goals, both for the Gulf in this case, for the Mississippi River Basin, or for these major watersheds. So that's a tool that we've had for a couple of years, and we've been continually updating this based on feedback. And it's an important part of these tools are an important part of how we're doing our implementation strategy, and also doing our tracking, and then looking at as we do revisions to our nutrient strategy in the future, that we kind of move more towards the electronic side of things. Things are more interactive, and things that can be updated incrementally, instead of doing a big effort all at one time. So with that, that's kind of gets the end of my talk, and I think I got up to the 40 minutes there on that. And so we've got a newsletter and our webpage where you can find information about our nutrient strategy. We have a number of videos that we have, webinars that were done last year, that kind of go over this information in more detail if you're interested in that. And with that, I'll take any questions on that. So.
All right, so we have had a few questions come in. If you still have any questions, please get those into the chat. So how did you identify sources or contributions of nitrogen between tile or groundwater?
It's a good question. I think, we looked at, it's kind of we did some generalizations, because it's kind of variable between different parts of the state, and we worked with basically based on some of our watershed modeling work that we've done we have hydrologic simulation program Fortran, or HSPF models, throughout the whole state. And so we used kind of the methodologies we've used on those various watersheds, and how we break that apart, especially in areas of like southeastern Minnesota, where a lot of the contribution of nitrates coming really from the groundwater side of things, and we don't see a lot of tile drainage, versus areas. And where I live in Mankato, and so I'm in the heart of the Minnesota River Basin, where a lot of that's based on tile drainage. So we kind of looked at kind of what we're seeing for agricultural drainage, percentages of that, versus these other types of groundwater aspects as well. So, but I think we can, within our kind of our nutrient strategy document, and some of our there's more detail and depth in that in the chapter dealing with our source assessments. And I think there's also some kind of appendices that connect with that as well.
What models or data are used in the BEAT planner for practices? Is it based on the science reviews of practice effectiveness?
Yeah, so we use, for the loads in that tool, we use the HSPF modeled loads. And so we work with a contractor that helps us kind of in our modeling staff at the MPCA to get kind of average loads for those minor watersheds, and how and so we update that as we get new information. But then for the BMPs, we use the reduction efficiencies from the nutrient reduction strategy. So we'll be updating the BEAT tool with the latest efficiencies later this year. And so currently it has the same efficiencies that we had from the 2014 nutrient strategy, and some other, and also from our Minnesota Department of Agriculture has an agricultural BMP handbook, which kind of looks at also at efficiencies. So we kind of use those, and use a lot of the Iowa nutrient reduction strategy efficiencies as well. But now that we have some slight adjustments to make, and some additional added BMPs. So we use both for the loads, it's from the HSPF models, and then we use the nutrient reduction strategy efficiencies for the BMPs reductions from those loads.
Are the watershed management plans you mentioned towards the beginning of your talk available to view online?
Yes, if you go, I in my career, I used to work for the Minnesota Board of Water and Soil Resources, and if you go to their sites, you can probably do a search for the One Watershed, One Plan program, and there you can link to. They have a kind of an interactive map that has kind of the status of those plans, and then you can click on them, and I think, and then get to a link to those local plans, which a lot of times are hosted on a county or a soil water conservation district website. So there is a linkage to that, on their webpage.
Does the tile water management category include bioreactors, saturated buffers, wetlands, and controlled drainage?
Yeah, maybe I could go back to that. Yes, and so we kind of looked at all of those within. I have to go back quite a bit, which will make people dizzy. But yeah, we look at yeah, so we looked at drainage water recycling, shallow drainage, bioreactors, saturated buffers, controlled drainage, and we also looked at wetlands as well. And we did the phosphorus work. We updated some of the information on wetlands, and we have a lot of wetland restoration work that's been done through the Reinvest in Minnesota program, have conservation easements, and also through a couple, 3 different CREPs, that conservation reserve enhancement programs that have been done over the years. So we've also looked at that. And one of the things I think in Minnesota we're looking at different ways, both in the Mississippi River Basin and especially in the Red River Basin, is how to do more water storage with kind of impoundments. And there's been some research on that, but that's an area that we need to do more research on. Especially in the River Basin, we've got some very large impoundments because they have a lot of flood control issues, and we're trying to look at kind of what the nitrogen benefits of those practices as well. Yeah.
So it looks like you've seen some progress on nitrate reduction since the start of the strategy. What do you attribute this reduction to?
That's a good question. I think, I think we are seeing quite a bit of, well, even just looking at this, the number of, like some of the practices, seeing adoption of cover crops. I think, nutrient management has been increasing. We've also seen increased crop residue levels as well. So I think, a lot of it is really be attributed to, I think, work that we've seen on the agricultural side of things. There's also, some thought about, we've had much higher flows than we've had in the past, and is that kind of based on increased rainfall, and is there some kind of dilution factor as well going on as well? Because we're seeing some of the, at least on the concentration side, some of those concentrations going down. So it's kind of there's probably good news and bad news, maybe within both of that. But I think we we have seen some progress on, BMP adoption, but we do have quite a ways to go for our nitrogen goals. So it's a kind of a large task of implementation for that.
And then do your strategies consider only existing weather or differentiate between dry, average, and wet years?
Yeah, I guess we did do for our loads, we did, do the flow normalized loads, and I'm not probably the best expert to talk about the flow normalized load work that was done, but we tried to, even out things because of those weather conditions, and kind of using those, it's the WTDRS loads, and so we worked with the Met Council and USGS on that, along with our staff at MPCA, to kind of help get a better sense of where we're at because of those conditions. So I guess we did take that in consideration.
All right, so it looks like we've gotten through all of the questions. Do you have any final words you'd like to leave everyone with?
No, I really appreciate the time, and if there's additional questions that people have down the road or would like to talk more in detail, just let me know, or talk with Corey Layfield or myself, and we can do that. And yeah, I really appreciate the time, and I've always enjoyed working with folks down in Iowa as well, in Iowa State. So they've been a really good partner with us up in Minnesota too. So much appreciated.
All right, well, thank you so much for your talk. It was great hearing what's going on in Minnesota.
Do you want me to